The DRA blasts the Minnesota administration's pledge conference. The DRA's chairman addresses K. Forbes Smith, and police investigate the country's latest homicide. Good evening, everyone. I'm Leah Cooper with your JCN News for this Friday, February 11th. Chair of the Disaster Reconstruction Authority, Alex Storr, blasting the former administration's Hurricane Dorian Pledge Conference held in January of 2020 following the monster Category 5 storm that devastated Abaco, its Keys, and Grand Bahama in September of 2019. Mr. Storr calling the Pledge Conference held under the Minnesota administration nothing more than a public relations exercise. The conference allegedly raised $1.5 billion. Mr. Storr had these shocking words during the Office of the Prime Minister's weekly press briefing.
In the first instance, the Pledge Conference, from what I have seen so far, was nothing but a PR exercise done to fool the Bahamian people. The 1.7 billion, or however much the figure was, what actually materialized is nowhere near that figure. Now, donations that came in, some were earmarked for specific projects and were used for those projects. Some had caveats with them that entailed other things to go along with it, and so some people were using it as a method of getting their foot in the door in the hurricane relief to benefit their businesses.
Governments, NGOs, multilateral institutions, companies, and individuals pledged some $1.5 billion in recovery funding and in-kind services in January of 2020 at the Hurricane Dorian Private Sector Pledging Conference. The pledges included initiatives in home building and repair, educational assistance, renewable energy partnerships, relief aid, grants, direct assistance to storm victims. Mr. Storr says the DRA has to sort through those pledges, and he has yet to receive an official tally of what was promised versus what was actually received. As the Free National Movement heads into convention next week, the party will have to defend its record on the Disaster Reconstruction Authority after a number of details have been released regarding the contract awarded to the former managing director, K. Forbes Smith, who is suing the government for breach of contract. In this next report, we hear a call for an inquiry into the DRA.
In the midst of a court battle between former Senator K. Forbes Smith, who is also former managing director of the Disaster Reconstruction Authority, or the DRA, PLP Chairman Fred Mitchell is calling for a commission of inquiry into the DRA while under the charge of Mrs. Forbes Smith. Mrs. Forbes Smith recently filed a lawsuit against the government for contractual damages just over $408,000. Forbes Smith and the Free National Movement have come under fire regarding the nature of that contract and the extent of reconstruction done on both Abaco and Grand Bahama since Hurricane Dorian. Mr. Mitchell believes an inquiry should be forthcoming.
This is yet another example which cries out for a commission of inquiry with a single commissioner to determine the facts, so that the people of the country will know what an F&M disaster the Disaster Relief Agency was. Poor Michael Pintard, leader of the opposition. All the oxygen will be sucked out of his convention coming up by the question, where did the money go under the F&M?
Forbes Smith says she properly and competently carried out her duties under the 4-year fixed-term contract, which began December 2019 and runs until November 2023. Mr. Mitchell also questioned Forbes Smith's character based on a decision she was recently forced to make.
The Lady K. Forbes Smith was forced by the opposition PLP, as it then was, to choose between being president of the Senate and the director of the Disaster Relief Agency. Some wanted her to take both, but when told of the constitutional impropriety, she chose the $500,000 contract and benefits. It tells you much about the character of such persons. It says much about the character of Mrs. Forbes Smith and Prime Minister Minnis. Hubert Minnis, the former Prime Minister, was asked by the intrepid pressman, what about the enormous contract of K. Forbes Smith? His reply, he couldn't recall the details. Blow me down. $500,000 in benefits.
Alex Storr has been appointed the chairman of the DRA, and according to Mr. Mitchell, what Mr. Storr and his team have discovered thus far in the workings of the DRA has been disappointing. He says the PLP Member of Parliament for Central and South Abaco, John Pinder, is reporting the same shortcomings of the previous administration.
I congratulated the younger Mr. Storr for responding to the writ filed on behalf of K. Forbes Smith. It is about time the PLP speaks up about the disaster that the Disaster Relief Agency has been for the people of Abaco and Grand Bahama. Mr. Storr and Mr. Pinder both commented on the shocking lack of performance of the Disaster Relief Authority under Hubert Minnis.
There are also unconfirmed reports of a 154 kilowatt generator donated to the Disaster Reconstruction Authority being sold to a private company on Grand Bahama for $16,000 for personal gain during Forbes Smith's tenure as managing director, which is part of the reason Mr. Mitchell is calling for an inquiry. Chirino Saunders, JCN News.
Executive Chairman of the Disaster Reconstruction Authority, Alex Storr, also addressing the elephant in the room and weighing in on the lawsuit fielded by former Managing Director of the DRA, Catherine Forbes Smith, against the government. Mrs. Forbes Smith is suing the government for some $400,000, and Chairman Storr says the DRA could put that amount of money to good use.
The former managing director's termination, this is a matter that is currently being litigated. I will not speak on it, save to say that you guys have seen the amounts, you have heard the projects and mismanagement thereof, and so the Bahamian people can decide whether they were getting value for their money. And as I said when we were in Grand Bahama, I know the amount that is being asked for in the suit is some almost $500,000. And I asked the question, do you know how many people the DRA could help with $500,000?
Chairman Storr says the DRA would be able to help at least 17 families for this amount of money. Ms. Forbes Smith has filed a formal complaint against the Bahamas government for an alleged breach in contract. The writ, which was filed in the Supreme Court by Mrs. Forbes Smith, is seeking some $400,000 in damages. Now, Forbes Smith was hired to the position of director for the DRA under the Minnis administration, and her contract was subsequently terminated after the Davis administration prior to the predetermined expiration date. The Bahamas has become one of the signatories of the Multi-Country Sustainable Development Corporation framework. The framework serves as the business plan for the United Nations agencies, funds, and programs from 2022 to 2026. Here's Laurencia Smith with the details.
The government continues to make moves to meet the United Nations Sustainability Development Agenda by 2030 by assigning a multi-country sustainability development cooperation framework for English and Dutch-speaking Caribbean nations for 2022 to 2026. This framework is a key element for the planning and the implementation of the UN development activities concerning the achievements of the 2030 Agenda. Prime Minister Philip Davis says that the signing comes at an opportune time for the Bahamas.
And so we are thrilled to become a part of this regional framework. Grateful that it is to be created with our input, and happy that it ensures that all voices from participating countries in the region are heard and represented. Occasions like this remind us that we are more alike than we are different. This multi-country sustainable development cooperation framework reflects our determination to strengthen regional collaboration towards a common goal.
Acting Foreign Affairs and Public Service Minister Alfred Sayers, who's one of the signatories of the framework, says it's a historic development in the relationship between the Bahamas and one of its biggest development partners.
The Multi-Country Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework is one such transformative tool. It is firmly underpinned by the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, with a focus on the joint efforts of priority stakeholders, governments, regional and international development agencies, civil society, and the private sector.
UN Resident Coordinator Dr. Gary Cornell says that the framework is very much in line with the country's ambitions and priorities.
The signing of this framework today commits us further in this decade of action and reaffirms that more than ever, the 2030 Agenda is still very much alive and quite relevant. An assessment of multi-country progress on Agenda 23 revealed that throughout the Caribbean, the SDG related to the planet remain under serious threat and are generally not improving. It indicates that people-centered SDGs are likely to have taken a particularly hit from COVID-19 and will require recalibration of priorities to minimize the negative impact. It found that different segments of the population are in particularly vulnerable situations and struggle to engage with the opportunities presented by social and economic development. Overall, the data shows that dramatic acceleration is required around multiple SDGs in all countries if Agenda 2030 is to be sustainably achieved.
Mr. Davis says that the success of the framework ultimately depends not only on the cooperation of the government and multilateral partners, but also on the cooperation of civil society, the private sector, and everyone here in the Bahamas. I'm Laurencia Smith for JCN News.
Thanks, Laurencia. You're watching JCN News. Stay with us.